Hello, welcome to 949 Racing SuperMiata. Today we're going to assemble a Gen 2 Xida. This is identified by the orange lower spring perch. That's a Gen 2 made by Tractive in the Netherlands. The earlier Gen 1 Xida was made by AST and had a black lower spring perch. We have a separate video for that, so look for our YouTube page. The instructions are a little bit different, so don't try to use one for the other. So if you got a Gen 2 with the orange spring perch, this is your video. So I'm going to take it apart first. First, I want to go through a few things externally here, kind of important notes. This bottom half of the shock is sort of a no-fly zone in terms of maintenance. So this is the nitrogen port. This is used during assembly. At the factory, this is not a user serviceable port. In fact, you can read this fine print here. It says, don't even think about it. The idea is on some race shocks that need to be tuned via nitrogen pressure, guys will open this up, put a port in there and change the nitrogen pressure. Trust me, you don't have the tools to do this correctly. You'll mess up the shock and it won't be under warranty if you take this off. So just don't mess with that. Also, this is not a length adjustable shock. It kind of looks like one, but it isn't. This is actually a locking collar that locks the bottom cap to the body. It is not an adjustment. It is something that's designed to hold the shock together. It's actually got a thread sealant in there, and if you try to take it off, you'll just tear the heck out of this and ruin your shock. So this is not user serviceable. So don't touch, don't touch. I know it looks like a length adjustment. Trust me, it isn't. It actually holds the bottom half of the shock together. Moving up a little further, you've got your spring perch here, and let's spin this around. Here's your set screw, and this is a 2.5 millimeter. Also go to over the tools real quick. This is a 2 millimeter Allen key. That's for the adjuster knob. You have this in your toolbox. 2.5 millimeter. That's for the spring perch. And this 5 millimeter. This is a very high tech tool. That's what we use the 5 millimeter for. Xidas don't come with the pin spanner. If you have a pin spanner that works there, you're welcome to use it, but I'll be honest with you, we've had a couple different designs. The one that works the best in the tight confines of a Miata control arm assembly is this guy right here, because it fits real tight and you can just do like so. It works just fine. So this screw has a little tension on it, that's why it's a little harder to turn. But anyway, you'll pull this out. Actually, you won't pull this out, but if you were, you would see that it's got a little snout on it here. Down inside of here, there's a little rubber plug that's built into the collar. That plug keeps this from damaging these threads. So don't think that you're going to mess this up by tightening it. And it doesn't need to be super tight. This collar will not spin under normal use. You really don't have to worry about it coming loose. It's not like something has to be torqued heavily. So just good and snug, and you'll feel it snug down. That's it. It's not going anywhere. Don't go crazy with the torque on it. So that's that part of it. I'm going to go ahead and take the shock apart. Now, the reason you would want to take the shock apart is if you're doing a spring rate change, for example, if you're trying different springs, or if your Torrington bearings have just kind of gotten corroded, they're not moving freely, or you want to take them apart and clean them, or any other reason you need to take the shock apart. So I'm going to take our little 2 millimeter Allen key. I'm going to crack loose that set screw, and I'll show you here. I don't know if the camera will pick that up. There's a kind of a D-shaped shaft here. That little flat is where the set screw goes. So that's why that's like that. So these are 19 millimeter nuts. Not a bunch of torque is needed for these when they're tight, but we'll get into that in a minute when we put it back together. So I'm going to go ahead and unscrew this real quick. And I'm going to take this out of the camera range here so I can get some leverage on it. And what you're doing is just going to take apart this top nut and loosen it up. And take the shock apart real quick. And let's say take the shock apart. I'm not literally taking the shock apart. I'm just pulling the spring off. But this is something that some owners will do. The reason this is kind of important is some people already have this NB plate. This is the factory Mazda upper shock mount from the NB chassis. That's the 99 to 05. So we call these NB mounts. So your car may already have these, or you've got some used ones laying around. So you buy the shock like this, and you just put this guy on. And when you buy them like this, you're going to get it with all these bushings in the stack, and all you're doing is pulling the nut off and putting your mount on. So again, I'm going to pull this all apart, get all the bits and pieces off, so you can see the sequence. And again, it's a little bit different from the Gen 1, so don't use the Gen 1 for this and vice versa. Pull all the pieces off here, and we'll go through all the part nomenclature. So first off is your Torrington bearing. So the Torrington bearing is actually this guy here. It's a thrust washer, so it's like a lazy Susan. The two things can move independently on them. So It's a 440C stainless roller and then a chrome steel cage. And this can work on steel. Since this is aluminum, we include these little TRA 3648 races, the chrome steel races. So it's like a sandwich. You see that the bearing goes in between, race on either side. So that goes right onto the lower perch. So that's first. Second thing is this coupler. Now I want to show you, there's actually 3 of these couplers with each shock. These are symmetrical, so you can mix and match them. You'll take one of these with the snout facing upwards, like so, and you'll drop your helper spring on. This is symmetrical, either way, it doesn't matter. Drop that on there. And what I usually do is put this on next. It's a little easier to get this on. Actually, I take that back. This goes on first. The couplers. Now these couplers, you're going to face them outboard like this. So one goes into each spring, and they couple the 2 springs. Like so, sits down in there. And what these are for is to help to keep the spring from flexing side to side. We'll get into that in a little bit in a minute, why that's important. So this comes with the shock. It's just a dust boot. We actually trim these down so they fit a little better. If you lose or damage this, it's not too critical. All this is doing is keeping the spring from rubbing here, but we find when we assemble shocks without these and run them for years and hammer the you-know-what out of them, they still don't get scratched. So it's not that big a deal. But since they come with them, we go ahead and throw it on there because why not? There's no harm for it being along for the ride. So put that over there, mount it flush with the top. You're ready for your mainspring. You're gonna put your mainspring back on. Oh, and by the way, you see your bump stop. See how the taper that faces the shock. Anytime you have a bump stop, the taper always faces the shock. So the thick part will always be at the top. It has to do with the way this thing deforms as it deflects, in any case. Mainspring, again, that's symmetrical, doesn't matter which way you go. You're gonna put your mainspring on there. And then you're gonna put your upper spring perch. You'll notice there's a curved portion there, so that interfaces with this curve on the NB mount. It's designed to self-center there. You'll see the square shoulder there fits into the spring. And then, oh, here, take the bushing and washer off. I'm gonna go ahead and remove this. So you've got the shoulder on the shaft here. You got 2 of these washers. These washers are symmetrical, up, down, sideways are all the same. So just drop it down on there. And you'll take your 2 bushings, and let's go ahead and zoom in on these bushings for a moment. So there's 2 of these bushings. Lower is the big one, and this one here is the upper. So that's a 5052 bushing, I believe. And this is an 8133. You notice this one has a nipple in it, and that nipple interfaces with the NB mount. See how it pokes through there, and that helps to keep the shaft from moving side to side. So let's go back here, get the shock. Bushing with the nipple facing upward, that's the lower bushing. Just shove it down on there. Your NB, oops, get a little sequence here. Your spring locator, NB mount, bada bing. And then you get your upper bushing. This has a nipple on it too. I usually do it with the nipple facing upward. I'll show you why in a minute. It makes it a little easier to set the torque on it. Your upper washer, again, doesn't matter which way that goes on there. And then your top nut. Well, that's pretty high tech and that's pretty complicated, but that's all there is to it. Now, for setting the torque on this, these don't have to be really tight. And you can, if you were to go crazy with this and put a big torque wrench and just go blap, blap, blap on it, you'd actually snap the shaft off. You'd ruin your shock. It'd be really bad, so you don't want to do that. Now, if you'll notice here, there's a little bit of an air gap between this washer and this bushing, since there's that little nipple that hasn't been like smushed down yet. And that's a gauge to use how tight to make the top nut. So I want to show you here. Now you notice this is a nice cylinder of a bushing, right? As I tighten this down, it's gonna crunch kind of that nipple a little bit. I'm gonna have to hold this a different way so I can get a little torque on it. So we're going to just tighten this down a little bit, and it's going to crush that small nipple portion, and then it's going to begin to distort that bushing just snug. I don't know if the camera will pick that up, but you'll see that cylinder there. It's no longer a flat cylinder. It's kind of bowed out a little bit. Well, that's exactly what you're trying to do. All you want to do is take out the vertical slack in this. You don't want the mount to be able to flop back and forth, but you don't want to go so tight that it's pinched in place. It should move them out, and I can't really do this by hand, but when it's in the car, this will actually deflect and move quite a bit. That's what you want. You want this thing to move as freely as possible in this axis, but not be able to move this direction. So just snug, and then you put your top nut on there, and this is where you want to have a little bit of torque. This one against this one, so you don't want to just take this one and hammer on it with the big giant impact. So what you'll do is you'll spin both of them down, you'll over tighten it, and if you go crazy with it, again, you'll snap the shaft. This shaft is hollow because your adjuster rod goes down there, so it's actually a hollow shaft. And it's got, a million little stress risers in it. So if you get crazy with it, you will snap the shaft and you'll ruin your day. So best way to do this, you can, 2 ways to do this. One is to get a little screw gun, like a little cordless screwdriver, and put one of those little adapters on it. You can put a socket on there because they don't do a lot of torque. It's a very light torque, and it'll just go tap, 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 and it'll lock this thing in place. You're good to go. The other way is if you have a thin wrench, like a bicycle wrench is real thin, or if you have another thin wrench, you just lock these two together. So these can be tied against each other, but you don't want to hammer this whole thing down and over tighten this bushing. So this is not torqued, it's not ready to go in yet, but it shows you the assembly process. So you're going to take your adjuster knob here. I got to find that flat. There we go. And we're going to snug that down. Again, doesn't have to be super tight. These don't come off. You know, I take that back. Occasionally on some cars that have race mounts, the whole car will vibrate enough. We have seen these vibrate loose. If you get them on and you forget to tighten it and you just set it on there and kind of go like that where it's not even tight, they can vibrate off, and you will find these laying around inside of the back of the car. So just, you know, make sure it's good and snug, but don't go crazy with it. These are available on our website. And you know, I'm going to show you something else as long as I have this. There's a separate video for adjusting the, replacing the detent mechanism. Kind of hard to see here, but this is another threaded portion, a brass shaft, and a little set screw. This little mechanism is about this long. It's about 10 millimeters long. This is the actual clicking mechanism. The rod that goes down through the shock that adjusts the damping, there's no clicker and it just spins around. This is what's called the detent mechanism, informally known as the clicker. So this can be replaced if you bend it. There's a separate video, look on our YouTube page for that, but just want to show you that that's what that's for. And so you're gonna tighten this down, make sure it's good and snug, and that's ready to go. Mine is properly torquing that, but that's basically it. Now, if you have any questions, head over to 949racing.com and click on the suspension link. If you want to email us, it's info@949racing.com. Hopefully that answers all your questions. We'll see you at the track.